In this video, we'll cover the basics about breeding evidence codes. Breeding evidence codes are the foundation for collecting atlas data. They're very important for us because birds move. They give us a way to record the evidence that a bird is in fact breeding, give us a way to compare between atlases. They measure the confidence that breeding is in fact occurring, and these codes follow international standards. Most importantly, don't be overwhelmed by the breeding evidence codes. There's no need to memorize them right away or in fact ever. Breeding evidence codes are grouped into 4 categories, from observed to possible to probable to confirmed, and that order is increasing confidence that the bird is actually breeding. So when we know a bird is confirmed, we know that species was definitely breeding in that location, versus possible, where they might be breeding but we really aren't totally sure. So observed are things like a loon flying over a site. So this is just the bird is observed, but there's no actual breeding evidence observed. Possible codes are things like this American redstart. These are the lowest level of breeding evidence. So in this case, the bird is singing, so we use the S code. Another very commonly used code that's in the possible category is H, for present in breeding season and breeding habitat. These are your 2 most commonly used codes, probably account for something like 80% of records. So if you can memorize those 2 codes, you're in very good shape. Next level up are our probable codes. So this is our second level of breeding evidence, a little more confident than the possible codes. In this situation here, we have a male wild turkey displaying. So it's doing a display. That's the D code, which includes courtship, displays. The key is there's some sort of interaction between individuals of the same species. Our final category are confirmed codes. So this is the highest level of breeding evidence. We confirm that the species is in fact breeding in the location or the site. In this case, we've got great horned owl young in a nest. So we use the NY code, nest with young. You can find a full list of the breeding evidence codes on the Atlas website. There's lots of resources we have to help you out. On the Atlas website, birdsontario.org, just under the Tools and Resources menu, there's the breeding evidence codes option. That will bring you to the full list of breeding evidence codes, and they're listed from observed to confirmed, and within each of those categories, they're listed from lowest to highest evidence. If you're using the app, there you have this information built right in. So you can view the breeding evidence codes by clicking on the breeding evidence box for a given species. You can view them in grid view, that's what you see on the left, or you can view them in list view, that's what you see on the right. If you view them in list view, you get a very short definition of the code, so it helps as a reminder if you haven't memorized those codes yet, you can get the reminder using list view. You'll have noticed on that last slide some of the codes were in different colors, green, yellow, red. So those are our breeding code warnings. They are things like cautions. So if it's an unusual code or a code that you need to use caution for, it will give you that warning. If they're unusual for that species, then they'll be coded in yellow. And then things that are in red are codes that are invalid for that particular species. So an example of a caution would be if you were trying to use the pair code for a species in which the male and female look identical, then you'd get a caution, because that's you got to use caution using that code. Unusual code, an example would be American woodcock. If you hear one doing its Twitter kind of dance, that counts as a S code, singing, rather than the D code for display, unless you have interaction between 2 individuals of that species. And then an example of an invalid code would be something like brown-headed cowbird, and you try to use the nest building code. They don't build nests, so we've blocked that one out. So these cautions and unusual codes and invalid codes, These are on a species-specific basis based on the species biology. Also on the website, under that same menu as the list of breeding evidence codes, we have a breeding evidence code quiz. So you can go through a whole bunch of dozens and dozens of hypothetical scenarios, and it'll give you a chance to pick which breeding evidence code you think applies, and then it will tell you whether you're right or wrong. So it's a good way to practice and learn some of the ins and outs of breeding evidence codes. If you're looking for help on a particular code or particular situation, you can go to our discussion forum that's found under the Get Involved list of menus. And the discussion forum has a channel dedicated to breeding evidence codes where you can ask our atlasing community questions about particular codes, and you'll get feedback from other atlasers or atlas staff. So there's some common pitfalls that we see kind of year after year when it comes to breeding evidence codes. First pitfall is with the FY code for fledged young. So the bird on the left, the tiny little baby grouse, that's a great example of an FY situation where you use FY. The bird on the right, the bald eagle, that is maybe born that year or it's an immature bird, but it's definitely capable of sustained flight, could have traveled many kilometers to get where it is. That is a bird that you would not code with FY. Another common pitfall is when you get a situation like this. Here's a wood thrush sitting on a nest. Do you use nest with eggs, the NE code? Do you use NY, nest with young? And the answer is we don't use either of those based on this because we can't tell if it's sitting on eggs. Probably sitting on eggs, but we don't know for sure. Maybe it's just sitting there. But what we do know is there's a nest with an adult on the nest, so we can use the AE code for adult entering. So we don't want you to guess, but we do want you to use the highest breeding evidence code that applies in the situation. Another one is one I've already mentioned with American woodcock. It's the same, applies for Wilson snipe doing that winnowing up in the air. This counts as the bird's song, so we use the S code. The only time you would use the D for display is if you saw some sort of interaction between a male and a female or two males of the same species. Another one is a situation where you see things like barn swallows or rock pigeons flying in and out of a barn or a suitable nesting area. You can use the V code, visiting probable nest site, in situations like that. So that's one that kind of gets overlooked, but it's a good way to get things like barn swallows and rock pigeons up to probable breeding evidence code. So just to recap, breeding code evidence codes are a foundation of atlasing. They really are more straightforward than most people think. They seem daunting at first because there's a number of them, but they really are quite straightforward. And in reality, you're only going to ever use, most people only ever use a very small proportion of the breeding evidence codes. A lot of them are used quite rarely. Use the list view in the app. If you don't have them memorized, it'll give you the short definition. And the most valuable checklists that we receive are ones where breeding evidence codes are filled out for every species, assuming that one does apply. If it's not a breeding species or it's outside of the breeding season, then don't fill that in. But if you can fill it in for as many species on a checklist as possible, you'll make your data more valuable. Remember not to guess. You can always refer back to these reference materials that we talked about today, such as the list of breeding evidence codes, the quiz, and of course we've got our excellent community to help you out. So I hope that gets you started with breeding evidence codes and you enjoy contributing to the Atlas.